Hello, and welcome to Topic 10, Chapter 7 in your textbook. And this chapter is dedicated to learning about the news media. And this lecture is going to focus on the role that the news media plays in a democracy. So, what are we going to cover in this lecture? In this lecture, we're going to focus primarily or exclusively on the role of the news media in a democracy. That's a theme we've been working on throughout the course of the semester, so we'll continue it with this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to look at whether or not there are any checks on the power of the media. And so that's what we've got on the docket for this in the next lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. On this slide, you see that there's an array of examples of news media. But there's also this really great quote from the book that I used for my civil liberties class, where we spend some time learning about press freedoms. And the name of that book is Rights, Liberties, and Justice. And in that book, it says that freedom of the press is perhaps the most visible manifestation of Americans exercising their expression rights. And I really like that quote. And the reason that I like it is because clearly the First Amendment gives us freedom of speech, the freedom to personally express ourselves. But really that personal expression, while it's obviously extraordinarily important in a democracy, a lot of times we don't really see people personally expressing themselves. There's not a lot of times when you walk down the corner, you're on the sidewalk walking around and you just see somebody standing on the street corner sort of like expressing themselves, promoting, particular political viewpoints, or even in the public park or where have you. And so while we have this liberty of freedom of speech and we do exercise it, it doesn't really manifest itself in the same way that freedom of the press does. Because freedom of the press is the freedom for an entity, the journalists, publications, news stations, radio stations. It's there. It gives them the right, that entity, those corporations, the right to express themselves. And they're expressing themselves in a way that can really reach a lot of people. So I was sort of struck on our midterm exams that when we were asked to, rank the different liberties, that freedom of the press actually got ranked quite low by many of the students in this class. And the argument was, well, we have freedom of speech, so do we really need freedom of the press, right? Because we can already express ourselves. But the difference here is that freedom of the press really allows information to be spread to a lot of people, right? Mass information in a way that individual expression cannot. And so all of those are examples there of entities that express information, provide and purvey information to people within the United States and beyond. And so you see there are some, legacy newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times. You see broadcast news organizations, CNN, National Public Radio, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which, while that is from Britain, it's a really good source of international news. ABC, MSNBC, Fox News. Frontline, that is from PBS, Public Broadcasting Services, and it's a great documentary series that does a lot of investigation about activities in the United States and beyond. And I've got this here because this week, Bob Woodward, who is pictured right here, this is Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They were the two investigative reporters from the Washington Post in the 1970s that broke open the Watergate story that basically showed that President Nixon was involved in the burglarizing of the Democratic National Committee office in the Watergate office building. And he'll be speaking on our campus, which is quite an honor this week. And so, again, all of this sort of illustrates examples of the press, but also sort of the importance that visible manifestation of Americans exercising their expressive rights, how that it is illustrated through the news media. So, freedom of speech is extraordinarily important for a democratic society, but so is freedom of the press. And so, let's take a look at the role that the news media plays in a democracy. So, this is a theme that we're sort of, looking at throughout the course of the semester, maintaining and keeping a democratic society. And, that since democracy rule the people, that one of the key components of a democratic society is that society is informed, it's knowledgeable, and it's active. Like it knows what's going on and it can act in a reasoned manner, okay? Because that's a truly meaningful democracy. That when people vote, they know about the issues that they're voting on, that they're knowledgeable, and they know when to act and when not to act. And so it's really difficult to achieve an informed, knowledgeable, and active citizenry without a news media that is independent of government control, right? That is allowed to inform the citizenry as it sees fit without the government entering into that transmission of information, censoring things, or punishing the news media for publishing certain things. And as we know, the First Amendment ensures that the press is free. And the way that the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, right? It's very straightforward. The way that that's been interpreted by the Supreme Court, what that means to be free, is that the press is free from this thing called prior restraint. When the government tries to exercise prior restraint, it's deemed unconstitutional for the most part. Okay, so what is prior restraint? Well, prior restraint is kind of what it sounds like: restraining the distribution of information prior to it actually having been distributed. And so it's the government blocking the publication of the news prior to its release. Okay. And so a really good example of prior restraint in the modern era is the Pentagon Papers. And so the Pentagon Papers were, it was a big study that was done by the Department of Defense on whether or not the Vietnam War was being successful, if it was being successfully fought, if we were sending more troops, more people to fight, more weapons, more money, then were we actually achieving our goals? And this report said, no, we really were not. We said we were achieving our goals in Vietnam, but we really weren't achieving our goals. So we were really wasting a lot of money and, more importantly, losing a lot of lives. For what? We weren't really effective in our plan. Well, that was a study that was done by the Department of Defense, and it was for their own purposes. But it got leaked, and Daniel, oh shoot, I'm forgetting. Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg was the individual who got his hands on the Pentagon Papers. He copied them, and then he handed them over to the New York Times, and then also to the Washington Post, got their hands on them as well. And that basically the New York Times decided to publish some of the Pentagon Papers. And they did it. And then government saw that they published it. And they said, you better not publish any more of those. Okay, we saw those papers, don't do anymore. We're putting prior restraint on you. We think that those are dangerous to national security. We're worried about what else you're going to publish. Don't publish anything else. And then the Washington Post, they basically, because they told the New York Times not to publish, then they basically were telling the Washington Post not to publish. And the Washington Post said, screw it. This is important. We think that the public needs to know about this. And they published the Pentagon Papers, okay? And then, then there was a big Supreme Court case that basically said that they didn't pose a threat to national security, and the government didn't have a right to place that prior restraint on these newspapers, okay? And so that blocking of publication by the government is known as prior restraint, and it is unconstitutional, and it is basically what gives the press the freedom to publish. Now, the press is the only private entity explicitly granted the protections of a liberty in the Constitution. All of the other liberties are granted to individual. Freedom of the press, obviously, that freedom is actually granted to an entity, to a corporation, which just basically shows you how important the framers thought that the freedom of the press was to the maintenance of a democratic society. And indeed it is, because it's one of the top markers for determining whether a country is democratic. And you look at authoritarian countries, and the first thing that they do, and do really well, is crack down on the press and jail people who publish things that threaten the dominant frame or viewpoint of the government. There are many roles that the news media plays in a democracy. We're going to focus on two of them. One, we're going to talk about the role that the news media plays in informing the people. And the other is that we're going to look at the role that the news media plays in keeping a check on government and also other institutions within the United States. And so it serves as a watchdog. And that is what is known as adversarial journalism. So let's dig in and take a look at both of these. So as we were discussing, a democracy needs an informed and knowledgeable citizenry. And it's through the news media in a democracy that citizens it's one avenue where citizens can get the information that they need to become informed and become knowledgeable so that they can appropriately and actively engage in our democratic society. Sort of the neat thing about the news media is that the news media, because it is close to political elites like the president, members of Congress, doing reporting on the Supreme Court, academic experts, right? Those are sort of can be sort of the political elite, right? They're the ones who have a lot of information about what's going on in the United States and the world. And the news media acts as sort of it levels the playing field. Because it has access to that information, it can get that information and then disseminate it broadly to the people who tune in to listen to their news broadcast, their radio broadcast, or to their to read their newspaper or magazine. And so the news media provides that necessary information. Now you might be saying to me, "Hey, Professor Hankinson, newsflash, didn't you know that the news media is just a bunch of BS these days, right? It's just bloviators who are there spouting off a bunch of opinions that aren't based on fact." And while that is the case for some news media, so-called news media, where it is, and we're going to be talking about this, what your textbook talks about as opinion-driven journalism that is oftentimes far from the facts, that large swaths of professional journalists dedicate their lives to going to journalism school and then getting trained on the job in how to be a principled journalist. Okay, and principled journalism, what is also sometimes known as hard news, but your textbook refers to it as principled journalism, and I kind of like that phrase. That it's journalism, it's the news media that is dedicated to accuracy, that is trying to report news as accurately as possible, that it avoids the personal views of reporters and editors in its news reporting. It tries to, it uses sources, original sources, to corroborate the news stories that it is doing. And it's then ideally it's transparent about where it's getting its resources from. And in its reporting, it will, report out multiple viewpoints. And there's a lot of news journalism like that that's going on. The New York Times hard reporting is like that. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the NewsHour on PBS, National Public Radio, the BBC, right? There's a lot of principled journalism to find. And so you just have to keep your eyes out for it. And it's not that hard to keep your eyes out for it, right? When you get older and you have enough money, just get a subscription to the New York Times or to one of the legacy newspapers that is dedicated to principled journalism. Another thing that the news media does, particularly that comes from this principled journalism school of journalism, is that it provides op-eds, okay, opinion pieces. And that you might say, well, wait a second, I don't want to read somebody's opinion. Well, but it'll be clearly labeled in the newspaper, as it is in legacy newspapers like the New York Times. It'll say the op-ed section, here are our opinion columnists. And that the opinions are based on fact, they're based on research, they're based on sources, and they provide an analysis and a particular perspective. It is not, doesn't, at least ideally, show up in the news reporting, and it gives people an opportunity to think about the information of the news, but think about it from different perspectives. And so I know for me, I read the New York Times, I read the conservative columnists, I read the liberal columnists, right? I read the capitalist columnists, I read the columnists that are, a little bit more critical of capitalism, because I like to get the different perspectives based on that fact-based analysis, okay? So ideally, that is what the news media is supposed to do when it is achieving its goal as informing the people within a democracy. So with this information from principle-based journalism, that people in a democracy should be able to be knowledgeable and cast informed votes about the issues and candidates that matter to them. However, as we were talking about in the last slide, let's keep it real, okay? That while there are many news sources to choose from that are dedicated to principled journalism, there are as many, if not more, so-called news sources that are not dedicated to principled journalism. And in fact, they are dedicated to what is known as opinion-driven journalism for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so opinion-driven journalism is the sort of journalism that seriously blurs between fact-based reporting and opinion. And oftentimes places prioritizes opinion and ideology over fact-based reporting. And in fact, they may look like they're doing fact-based reporting when in fact they are not. They're not transparent. Their sources are not cited. They're not doing original reporting, okay? And that can be very scary, right, in a democracy, because as we know, it becomes very difficult for people to know what news sources to trust and what not to trust. And in fact, as your textbook points out, that based on a report from the American Press Institute, that when asked, more than half of internet users reported that they could not easily tell the difference between news reporting and opinion about the news, particularly on social media. And so while we do have a good principled journalistic sources to choose from, and it's out there, it's a minefield out there, right, for most consumers of information, because it's difficult for them to differentiate between the principle-based journalism and this opinion-driven journalism. And plus, it's that kind of opinion-driven journalism that gets a lot of attention. It's sensational. It probably gets more ad coverage, right? People are talking about it more. And so it gets a lot of attention within the social stratosphere as well. And so that even though we do have freedom of the press, it's these sorts of challenges that are making that are presenting a challenge to the survival of our democracy. So the other role that the news media serves, that we're going to be talking about, is that the news media serves as a watchdog. And so, yes, the news media informs the people, but that the news media also plays a role in a democracy where they scrutinize the actions of elected officials and other public and non-public figures. They basically engage in what is called investigative journalism or adversarial journalism. And so sometimes the news media is referred to as the so-called fourth estate. And so the fourth estate serves as this sort of additional check on power. And so, as we know, our framers set up our institutions of government so that the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary all placed a check and were sort of watchdogs of the abuse of power of the other institutions. Well, the news media plays a similar role in our democracy. That because they scrutinize the actions of those who are serving in government, that then they can serve as a check on that power, report out to the people, and hold the government officials accountable if they are in fact abusing their power. And this fourth estate function is seen as needed for the smooth functioning of a democracy. There are several historic examples and more recent examples of this adversarial journalism, this news media serving as a watchdog. Of course, the famous one is the Washington Post and Watergate, which I'm sure Bob Woodward will be talking about. But that's where Woodward and Bernstein basically just, they investigated a break-in at an office building in Washington, D.C., and they just kept investigating it and publishing their reports in the Washington Post. And until they basically discovered that President Nixon was at the head of sort of the mastermind behind the break-in at the Watergate office buildings, and it led to his resignation. More recently, the Washington Post has done a lot of investigative journalism on the opioid crisis in the United States. So you can go to the Washington Post and look at the opioid files. And not only does it show the role that pharmaceutical companies played in abusing their power and duping the American public into getting more and more prescriptions for opioids, but it also showed the intersection between the federal government, the FDA, and sort of this approval process for these very dangerous drugs. And then New York Times, they did an investigation on the sex abuse and harassment of Harvey Weinstein, the head of the huge movie publishing industry within Hollywood, and Harvey Weinstein is currently in jail because of that, and not in small part due to the role that the New York Times played in that investigation. So it's through that investigative reporting that people get the information they need to hold those who lead us accountable, again, serving as this additional check on the abuse of power and holding those who serve us accountable. So if you're looking for some good movies to watch about the news media and serving its fourth estate watchdog function, here's really great movies to check out. Here in the middle is the famous movie All the President's Men, that's based on Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's book by the same title, starring Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. This is a great movie, and in fact, it streams for free at the UWM library. So you can just go to the library, log on, and you can watch that for free. I highly recommend that you check it out. It's actually quite scary. It's sort of a thriller. The Post, this is a Steven Spielberg movie starring Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, and it chronicles the decision that the Washington Post makes to run the Pentagon Papers. It's very Spielbergian if you like Spielberg, and it's a great story about their decision making. And then this is a movie called Spotlight, which is also very good. And in this, while these two hold the government accountable, Spotlight actually is a story about investigative journalism by the Boston Globe that looks at the abuse scandal of the Catholic Church in Boston. And this is the story of the work that the newspaper did to uncover the child abuse scandal that was going on and being covered up by the archdiocese in that area. It's a fascinating look, and it shows the different aspects of watchdog power. both of the government and then of institutions outside of government as well. All right, that's it for this lecture that focused on the role that the press plays in a democracy. On the next lecture, we're going to take a look at are there any checks on the power of the media? And so that's what we've got on the docket. Thanks for paying attention. Appreciate it. And I'll talk to you again soon.